If you're looking to buy a renovated property in upstate New York, check the historical zoning maps first. Don't just look at the flood zones or the property lines. Look at what was standing there 50 years ago. I'm a freelance architect. I've spent the last 6 years flipping mid-century moderns and restoring Victorians. I know structures. I know foundations. I thought I knew everything about what makes a building sound, but I missed this. I closed on the property at 42 Blackwood Lane on March 14th. It was a steal in every sense of the word. A 2020 renovation of a site that had been vacant since the early 80s. On the surface, it was perfect. A sprawling, open-concept ranch with quartz countertops, wide plank oak flooring, and massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the tree line. The listing price was $315,000, easily $200,000 under market value for this county. My lawyer, a nervous guy named David, hesitated at the closing table. He tapped a clause on page 47 of the deed. Easement B23. Preservation of subgrade structure. It implies the foundation is historic, David had said, adjusting his glasses. You can't alter the footprint below ground level. You understand that, right? I signed without looking up. I didn't care about the basement. I cared about the acre of land and the resale value. I figured it was an old coal cellar, or maybe a Cold War-era fallout shelter. In this part of the state, those are common. I moved in 3 weeks ago. The first week was bliss. The house was quiet, too quiet maybe, but I enjoyed the isolation. It wasn't until I started organizing the kitchen that I found it. The pantry is a walk-in, lined with white floating shelves. I was stacking cans of soup when I noticed the back wall didn't sit flush with the baseboard. There was a gap, maybe 1/4 of an inch. Being an architect, uneven joinery drives me insane. I pulled on the shelving unit, expecting it to be anchored to the studs. Instead, the entire back wall swung outward on silent, hidden hinges. It wasn't a wall. It was a facade. Behind the pristine white drywall stood a door that looked like it had been ripped straight off a submarine or a prison block. It was solid steel, painted a dull, industrial gray that was chipping away to reveal red rust underneath. There was no doorknob, just a heavy lever handle and a keyhole the size of a quarter. I shouldn't have been able to open it. But lying in the junk drawer of the kitchen island, left by the previous owners or the bank, I don't know, was a heavy brass key with a piece of masking tape on it. The tape had a single number written in faded Sharpie, 0. I remember the temperature drop the moment I slid the key in. It didn't click. It thudded, a heavy mechanical sound that vibrated up my arm. I leaned my weight against the lever and pushed. The air that rushed out wasn't musty like a normal basement. It didn't smell like mold or damp earth. It smelled like ammonia. Sharp, stinging ammonia and something metallic. Like old pennies, or dried blood. I stood there in my modern, sun-drenched kitchen, looking into a darkness that felt physically heavy. I didn't go down, not then. I just stared at the concrete stairs descending steeply into the black. I should have welded it shut right then. I should have packed my boxes and left the keys on the counter. But I'm an architect. I look for logic in design, and I needed to know why a brand new house was sitting on top of a steel vault. I grabbed my heavy-duty mag light from the garage before I took the first step. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating dust motes that hung suspended in the stagnant air. There were exactly 13 steps. I counted them. They weren't wood like the rest of the house. They were poured concrete, raw and unfinished, with jagged edges that snagged on the cuffs of my jeans. There was no handrail, just cold, cinder block walls on either side, painted a glossy institutional cream color that had yellowed with age. As I descended, the temperature plummeted. It must have been 68 degrees in my kitchen, but down here, I could see my breath misting in the flashlight beam. It felt like walking into a meat locker. When my boots hit the landing, I swept the light around. I expected a furnace, a water heater, maybe some storage crates. What I saw made my stomach drop. It wasn't a basement. It was a corridor. The hallway stretched out into the darkness, far longer than the footprint of the house above should allow. It was about 6 feet wide, the floor tiled in black and white checkers that were cracked and stained with something brown. On either side of the hall were doors. Heavy, gray metal doors, identical to the one in my pantry. I walked down the center of the hallway, my flashlight beam shaking slightly. The silence was absolute. No hum of electricity, no settling of the house. Just the wet slap of my boots on the tiles. I started counting the doors. On the left, 1, 3, 5, all the way to 21. On the right, 2, 4, 6, all the way to 22. And at the very end of the hall, facing me directly, was a single door, number 23. I walked up to door 4. It had a small, rectangular viewport at eye level, covered in reinforced wire glass. I shone my light through it. The room inside was small, maybe 6 by 8 feet. Empty. Concrete floor. A drain in the center. And embedded in the walls were rusted metal rings, restraints. I checked door 7. Same thing. Door 12. Same thing. The air down here was thick, almost oily. The smell I noticed earlier, ammonia and copper, was overpowering now. It smelled like a hospital that had been scrubbed clean but couldn't quite get rid of the scent of sickness. It caught in the back of my throat, tasting metallic. I turned back to look at the stairs. From down here, the light from my kitchen looked miles away, a tiny rectangle of safety. I was standing in a prison block buried beneath a luxury renovation. I didn't open any of them that first night. I didn't want to know what the air inside those sealed rooms smelled like. I turned around and walked back to the stairs, forcing myself not to run. But as I put my hand on the railing, no, there was no railing. As I put my hand on the cold wall to steady myself, I heard it, a click. It came from the end of the hall, behind me. I spun around, swinging the flashlight beam wildly. The hallway was empty. The doors were shut. But the handle on door 23, it was horizontal. I could have sworn it was vertical when I first looked at it. I tried to rationalize it. That's what humans do when confronted with the impossible. We build little logical bridges to walk over the gaping holes in reality. I told myself the handle on door 23 was loose. Gravity had pulled it down. Old springs, rusty mechanisms, simple physics. By Tuesday, 2 days after finding the quiet ward, I decided to reclaim the space. I wasn't going to let a creepy hallway dictate my life. I own this house. I own that concrete. I decided to use room 1 for storage. It was the closest to the stairs, meaning I didn't have to walk down that long tiled throat of a hallway. I hauled down 4 plastic totes filled with winter coats and my old drafting files. The door to room 1 was heavy solid steel, easily 200 pounds. It swung on well-oiled hinges that made zero noise, which was somehow worse than if they had creaked. Inside, the room was bare. Just that drain in the floor and the metal rings on the wall. I pushed the thought of what those rings were for to the back of my mind. I stacked the totes against the back wall. Then, because I'm paranoid, I took a heavy-duty master lock, the kind with the hardened steel shackle, and threaded it through the latch on the outside. I locked it. I tugged on it 3 times to be sure. I put the only key on my keyring, which never leaves my pocket. I slept fine that night. The next morning, I went down to grab a file I'd accidentally packed away. I froze at the bottom of the stairs. The door to room 1 was closed, but the padlock wasn't on the latch. It was sitting on the floor, in the center of a black tile, neatly placed. The shackle was open. My hand went to my pocket. The key was still there. I pulled it out, my fingers trembling slightly. I stared at the lock on the floor. There were no scratch marks. It hadn't been picked or cut. It had been unlocked. I picked up the lock. It was ice cold. I hesitated, then grabbed the lever of door 1 and pulled. The totes were still there, but they weren't against the back wall anymore. They were stacked in the exact center of the room, one on top of the other, forming a precarious tower that nearly touched the ceiling. The tote on the very bottom, the one with the heavy files, was now on top. The light plastic bin with the winter coats was crushing the bottom. Physics says that tower should have fallen. It didn't. It stood there, perfectly balanced, defying gravity. I backed out slowly. I reached for the door handle to slam it shut, but then I stopped. The house was silent, but the basement wasn't. From the far end of the hallway, down near the darkness where door 23 sat, I heard a sound. Slap, slap, slap. It was wet, rhythmic. It sounded exactly like bare, sweaty feet walking on polished concrete. I held my breath, straining my ears, praying it was a dripping pipe. Slap, pause, slap. It was getting closer. I didn't lock the door. I didn't take the totes. I turned and sprinted up the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I slammed the hidden pantry door and engaged the deadbolt I'd installed the day before. I stood in my kitchen, clutching a steak knife, waiting for the handle to turn. It didn't. But 10 minutes later, as I was trying to calm down, I realized something that made me sick. The sound of the feet hadn't been fast. It wasn't running. It was pacing. I drove into town, ostensibly to get coffee, but I ended up at the county records office. Being an architect gives you access to files most people don't look at. I told the clerk, a woman named Phyllis, who smelled like peppermint and cigarette smoke, that I was looking for the original site plans for 42 Blackwood to check a drainage issue. She handed me a heavy bound folio dated 1954. "You're the one who bought the old hillside property," she said, not making eye contact. Brave. I took the folio to a table in the back. I unrolled the blueprints. The modern house, my house, was just a faint pencil sketch on top of the original structure. The original building was massive, a sprawling brick complex labeled Street Jude Center for the Criminally Insane. My finger traced the foundation line. The main hospital had been demolished in 2018, but the substructure had been left intact. It was cheaper to build over it than to dig it out. I found the schematic for the basement level. It wasn't labeled storage. It was labeled wing seat, auditory isolation, and behavioral correction. Underneath that, handwritten in red ink by some long-dead administrator, were the words, "The Quiet Ward." I scanned the layout. Room 1 through room 22 were labeled isolation units. But room 23 wasn't an isolation unit. It was twice the size of the others. On the blueprint, it was labeled sensory negation chamber. My stomach turned. Sensory negation. That explained the thickness of the doors, the lack of ventilation sounds. It was designed to drive people mad with silence. I dug further, pulling microfiche from the local paper archives. I needed to know why it closed. I found the headline from the 14th of November, 1982. State shutters St. Jude's following staff disappearance. The article was brief, but chilling. During the graveyard shift change on November 12th, 3 orderlies, Mark Henson, David Miller, and Sarah Vance, had clocked in. They went down to Wing C to administer medication to a patient in room 23. They never clocked out. Police searched the facility. They searched the woods. They searched the drainage pipes. They found nothing. No blood, no signs of struggle. Just 3 uniforms folded neatly in a pile in the center of the hallway. And one other detail the reporter noted. Although the facility has been powered down for the investigation, officers reported a persistent, low-frequency humming sound emanating from the lower levels, which caused nausea and vertigo. I sat back in the wooden library chair, my hands cold. I had heard footsteps. That was bad enough. But looking at the dates, I realized something worse. The asylum closed in '82. The building was demolished in 2018. That meant for 36 years, whatever was in the quiet ward had been left alone in the dark. And I had just opened the door. I drove home as the sun was setting. I wanted to sell. I wanted to burn the place down. But as I pulled into the driveway, I saw something that froze my blood. The light in the kitchen was on. I live alone. I left the lights off. And through the floor-to-ceiling window, I could see the pantry door. It was wide open. I ran inside with my keys clenched between my knuckles, ready to fight. But the pantry door was closed. The heavy deadbolt I'd installed was still engaged. I checked the perimeter. No broken windows, no forced entry. That was almost worse. It meant either I was losing my mind, or whatever was down there was fast enough to close the door and lock it from the inside before I could get to the porch. I couldn't sleep. I knew if I closed my eyes, I'd see that long tiled hallway, but I also refused to go back down there without a plan. I needed eyes and ears in the dark. I drove to the 24-hour Walmart in the next town over and bought a Motorola Halo Plus baby monitor, the kind with night vision and 2-way audio. I also grabbed a roll of duct tape and a heavy industrial extension cord. At 11:45 p.m., I opened the pantry door. The smell of ammonia hit me harder this time, mixed with something sweeter, like rotting lilies. I didn't go all the way down. I stood on the bottom step and taped the camera unit to the ceiling, angling it so it looked straight down the corridor. On the small screen, the hallway was a tunnel of grainy green phosphor. The doors were black rectangles. Room 23, at the far end, was just a blurry distortion in the low-resolution feed. I set up the parent unit on my kitchen island, poured a glass of whiskey, and waited. For the first 2 hours, there was nothing. Just the hiss of digital static. The house settled around me, the wood groaning in the wind. Then, at 2:13 a.m., The audio meter on the monitor spiked. It wasn't a loud noise. It didn't clip the microphone. It was a low, steady frequency. I turned the volume up. The sound filled my kitchen. It wasn't mechanical. It didn't sound like a furnace or a compressor. It had a wet, organic quality to it. It rose and fell in pitch, very slightly, like breathing. I leaned closer to the screen. The image was stable for the most part, but down at the end of the hall, around door 23, the pixels were dancing. The image was tearing, lines of static cutting horizontally across the door frame. Interference. I grabbed my phone and downloaded a spectrum analyzer app. I held it up to the baby monitor speaker. The graph went crazy in the lower frequencies, around 19 hertzes. Infrasound, the fear frequency. It's known to cause hallucinations, nausea, and dread in humans. But the app picked up something else too. Buried in the low hum, there was a second layer of audio, a higher pitch. I pressed the monitor to my ear, closing my eyes to focus on the sound through the static. It wasn't just humming. It was a voice. Dozens of voices, layered on top of each other, all sustaining the same low note. Man. The screen flickered violently. For a split second, less than a frame, the door to room 23 didn't look closed on the monitor. It looked like it was standing wide open, and the darkness inside was spilling out into the hall like black smoke. Then the monitor snapped back to normal. The door was closed, but the humming didn't stop. It was getting louder, and now the display on the kitchen island was vibrating. The whiskey in my glass rippled. I reached out to turn the volume down, but before I could touch the button, the baby monitor let out a high-pitched screech feedback and went dead. Total silence returned to the kitchen, but the vibration in the floor, that was still there. I could feel it through the soles of my feet. Something massive was moving around down there, and it had just realized it was being watched. I don't remember falling asleep. The last thing I recall is the humming vibrating through the island countertop. I must have passed out on the sofa from a mix of exhaustion and that low-frequency dread. I woke up at exactly 3:13 a.m. It wasn't a noise that woke me. It was a change in air pressure. You know when you're in a car and someone rolls down a window? My ears popped. Then came the sound. Click. It came from the kitchen. It was the distinct magnetic thwack of the hidden pantry door, releasing. I lay frozen on the couch, staring at the ceiling. My heart wasn't beating, it was vibrating. I told myself it was the house settling. I told myself the latch was faulty. Then I heard the hinges. Scree. I grabbed the aluminum Easton baseball bat I keep under the sofa, a holdover from my college days, and a comfort for living alone in the woods. I swung my legs off the couch, my socks sliding on the hardwood. The kitchen is an open concept, visible from the living room, but the island blocks the direct view of the pantry. I crept forward, keeping low. The moonlight was streaming in through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, skeletal shadows across the white oak floor. "Is anyone there?" I called out. My voice cracked. It sounded pathetic in the large empty room. Silence. I rounded the island, bat raised, ready to swing at a burglar. The pantry wall was swung wide open, and behind it, the heavy steel door to the quiet ward, the one I had deadbolted, the one that requires a key to open from the outside, was standing ajar. Just an inch. A slice of absolute darkness cut into the gray steel. I stopped breathing. The key was still in my pocket. I could feel the jagged teeth biting into my leg through my jeans. Nothing human could have opened that door from the inside. That's when I saw the floor. Against the pale oak planks, a dark stain stood out like a wound. It started at the crack in the basement door and smeared outward into the kitchen. I clicked on the flashlight I'd left on the counter. It was a trail. A thick, viscous black sludge, shimmering like oil but smelling like bile and ozone. It wasn't a puddle, it was a drag mark. Something wet and heavy had pulled itself out of the basement. I followed the trail with a beam of light. It didn't go toward the front door. It didn't go toward my bedroom. It went to the kitchen sink. The trail ended at the base of the cabinet. I looked up at the sink itself. The stainless steel basin was splattered with the black filth, and the faucet was dripping. Drip, drip, drip. Something had come up, dragged itself across my floor, turned on the water, and then gone back? I looked back at the basement door. The black trail looped. It went back into the darkness. It hadn't escaped. It had come up for a drink, and as I stood there, staring at the black slime on my expensive renovation, I realized the scariest part wasn't the mess. It was the footprints in the sludge. They were human-shaped, but they were small. Too small for an adult, and they had too many toes. I waited until high noon. The sun was blazing directly overhead, filling the kitchen with blinding white light. It felt safer, even though I knew the physics of light didn't apply 40 feet underground. I had spent the morning scrubbing the black slime off the floor. It didn't just wash away. It had eaten into the polyurethane finish of the oak, leaving etched, dull trails like acid burns. Whatever came out of that basement was toxic. I couldn't live like this. I'm a rational man. I solve structural problems. The problem was in the basement, specifically in room 23. If I could just see it, really see it, in the harsh light of day, maybe I could understand it. Maybe it was raccoons. Maybe it was a homeless squatter. I grabbed a heavy-duty crowbar and a high-lumen construction work light. I propped the pantry door open with a chair. I wasn't getting locked in. The descent was harder this time. My legs felt like they were moving through waist-deep water. The air at the bottom was colder. The smell of ammonia now mixed with that thick copper scent of old blood. I walked past the first 22 doors. I didn't look at the viewports. I kept my eyes locked on the end of the hall. Door 23 loomed. It was wider than the others, the steel pitted with rust. There was no viewport. A sensory negation chamber doesn't have windows. The handle was still horizontal, unlatched. I kicked the door. It swung inward with a shriek of metal on metal that echoed like a gunshot. I raised the work light, flooding the room with 5,000 lumens of LED brightness. The first thing I noticed was the walls. They were padded canvas stuffed with horsehair, the old-school Asylum style, but the padding had been shredded, not cut with a knife, but torn, ripped away in violent jagged strips, exposing the brick underneath. The horsehair stuffing covered the floor like gray snow. Then I looked at the floor. The concrete was gouged. Deep, parallel furrows had been carved into the slab. I'm an architect. I know concrete. To scratch cured cement this deeply, you need diamond-tipped tools or heavy machinery. These marks looked like claw marks, but they were spaced like fingers. I stepped inside, the crunch of dried horsehair loud under my boots. The room felt angry. The air was stagnant and hot, contrasting with the freezing hallway. In the far corner, nestled in a pile of shredded canvas, was a small mound. It looked like a pile of white pebbles. I walked closer, crouching down, keeping the crowbar ready. My breath hitched in my throat. They weren't pebbles, they were teeth. Hundreds of them. I shone the light closer. There were molars, incisors, canines. Some were yellow and cracked, looking like they had been there for decades. But others were pristine white, small, sharp. I used the tip of the crowbar to shift the pile. At the bottom, the teeth were wet. The roots were still pink with fresh tissue. I gagged, stumbling back. These weren't just teeth from the patients in 1982. These were fresh. And then I saw the pattern. The teeth weren't just piled randomly. They were arranged. They were set in a perfect spiral, curling inward to a center point. And in the center of the spiral lay a single shiny object. I leaned in, fighting the urge to vomit. It was a button, a pearl button from a dress shirt. My hand flew to my chest. I looked down at my own shirt, the flannel I'd worn yesterday while moving boxes. The third button down was missing. A loose thread hung where it used to be. I didn't lose it in the wash. I didn't lose it in the yard. It had been taken, harvested, and added to the shrine. The storm hit the Hudson Valley at 8:42 p.m. It wasn't a gradual buildup. The sky just opened up and dropped a deluge that sounded like gravel being thrown against the siding. The wind howled through the eaves, making the whole frame of the house groan. I was in the living room, trying to research dental patterns and ritualistic sites on my laptop without vomiting, when the house plunged into darkness. No flicker, no brownout, just an instant, hard cut to black. I sat in the silence, listening to the rain hammer the roof. My laptop screen was the only light source, casting a pale, ghostly blue glow across the room. I waited for the backup generator to kick in. I'd paid extra for a whole house Generac system. It didn't fire. "Come on," I whispered, my voice sounding too loud in the dark. I knew where the main breaker panel was. Of course I did. I'm the idiot who bought the house. The electrical service entrance is underground, feeding into a sub-panel located in the basement, specifically on the wall directly opposite room 5. I grabbed the heavy mag light, the one I'd put fresh D-cell batteries in that morning. The beam cut a solid cone through the dark house. I walked to the pantry. The air coming up from the stairwell was different tonight. It wasn't cold. It was humid. It felt like walking into a jungle, heavy and wet, smelling of wet dog and that sharp, stinging ammonia. I went down. 1 step. 2 steps. The rain was muffled down here, a distant thrumming. The only sound was my own breathing, ragged and shallow. I reached the bottom landing and turned the beam toward the breaker box on the left wall. I didn't look down the hall. I refused to look at the darkness beyond room 5. I kept my eyes fixed on the gray metal panel of the breaker box. I opened the panel door. The main breaker was tripped to the off position. I reached out, my hand shaking, and grabbed the plastic switch. I shoved it to on. Nothing. The house stayed dark. I tried again. Click thunk. Nothing. Damn it, I hissed. That's when the flashlight flickered. It wasn't a battery fade. It was a strobe. The light pulsed violently, on, off, disorienting me. I smacked the side of the casing. "Don't do this," I begged. "Please don't do this." The bulb flared once, blindingly bright, turning the white tiles of the hallway into a sheet of burning snow, and then it died. Absolute, suffocating darkness. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I couldn't see the stairs. I was blind, 40 feet underground, standing next to room 5. I froze. I stopped breathing. I needed to listen. I needed to orient myself to run for the stairs. But before I could move, I heard it. From the far end of the hallway, from the deep dark, clunk. The heavy iron latch of a door being lifted. Then, the sound I had been dreading since I moved in. The long, rusted screech of hinges that hadn't been oiled in 40 years. Scree! Scree! Eck. It went on for 5 seconds. The sound of a heavy steel door being pushed all the way open. Then, silence. I backed up, my back hitting the cold metal of the breaker box. I fumbled for my phone in my pocket, my fingers numb and useless. Then came the sound of movement. Not the slapping feet this time. It was the sound of nails clicking on tile. Click, click, click. Fast, skittering. And it was coming from room 23. I knew I couldn't make the stairs. The skittering sound was moving too fast, like a massive insect scuttling over the tiles. If I ran, I'd trip in the dark, and whatever was rushing up the hallway would be on me before I could hit the first step. My hand brushed the cold steel frame of room 1 to my left. It was the only option. I threw myself into the room, my shoulder colliding hard with the concrete door jamb. I ignored the pain. I grabbed the inner lever of the heavy door and pulled. The hinges were silent, thank God for the oil I had applied days ago. I pulled the door shut, but I didn't engage the latch. The latch made a loud mechanical clack. Instead, I held the lever, keeping the door pulled tight against the frame, leaving a microscopic gap between the steel and the seal. I slid down the wall, curling into a ball in the pitch black, pressing my hands over my mouth and nose to stifle the sound of my own terror. The skittering stopped. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of my heart thumping against my ribs. It was so loud I was sure it was echoing in the hallway. Then, the smell hit me. It seeped through the hairline crack around the door. It wasn't just ammonia anymore. It was a thick, cloying scent of lilies, funereal flowers that had been left in a vase of stagnant water for a month. It was sweet, rot, and copper. It made my eyes water. Then came the sound. It was right outside the door. Sniff. It was a wet, snuffling sound, like a dog trying to pick up a scent, but much larger. The inhalation was long, rattling deep in a chest that sounded wet. I squeezed my eyes shut, as if that would help in the total darkness. My lungs were burning. I needed to breathe, but I knew if I let out even a whimper, the steel door wouldn't save me. The thing moved. It didn't walk away. It shifted its weight. I heard the fabric of clothes, or maybe skin, rubbing against the metal of the door I was holding. The heavy steel plate vibrated against my back. It was leaning against the door. I could feel the heat radiating through the metal. It was fever hot. The entity was standing right there, separated from me by 2 inches of steel. It wasn't a voice. It was a mimicry of a voice. A sound constructed from grinding bones and wet meat. It whispered the word, stretching the vowels until they snapped. My vision started to swim. The lack of oxygen, combined with the sheer primal overload of fear, was shutting my brain down. My extremities went numb. The darkness of the room began to spin, merging with the darkness behind my eyelids. The last thing I felt was the handle of the door starting to turn slowly under my grip, fighting against my hand. I let go. I didn't have a choice. The blackness took me. I woke up gasping, my lungs seizing as if I just surfaced from deep water. My body was curled in the fetal position on the cold concrete of room 1. My neck was stiff, and my left arm, the one I'd been lying on, was completely numb. For a second, I didn't know where I was. Then the smell hit me again. Not the rotting lilies this time, but the sharp, stinging scent of ozone and burnt dust. The power was back on. I could see the light seeping in under the steel door. The overhead fluorescents in the hallway were buzzing a low mechanical drone that sounded like a choir of angry wasps. I scrambled backward, pushing myself into the corner, waiting for the handle to turn. I waited for the whisper. Nothing. Just the hum of the lights and the thudding of my own pulse in my ears. I checked my watch. 5:45 a.m. I had been out for hours. Slowly, painfully, I stood up. My legs felt like jelly. I reached for the lever. It was cold. I pressed my ear against the steel. Silence. I opened the door a crack. The hallway was empty. The black and white tiles gleamed under the harsh artificial light. Door 23, way down at the end, was closed. The latch was horizontal locked. I stepped out, my knees shaking. I needed to get upstairs. I needed sunlight and a phone and a moving truck. I turned to close the door to room 1, just out of habit. That's when I saw it. The door to room 1 is painted that industrial gray, but now the paint was ruined. Deep, jagged scratches marred the surface of the metal. They weren't random claw marks. They were letters, crude, frantic, and carved deep enough to expose the raw steel underneath. D-O-N-O-T-L-E-A-V-E. I stared at the words, my brain struggling to process the syntax. D-O-N-O-T-L-E-A-V-E. It was written on the outside of the door. If the thing wanted to kill me, if it wanted to drag me into room 23 and add my teeth to the pile, then it could have. I was unconscious. I was defenseless, but it didn't enter. It stood outside. A chill that had nothing to do with the basement temperature washed over me. I looked at the scratches again. They were frantic, desperate, and then I looked up at the ceiling at the underside of the kitchen floorboards. Thump. It came from the kitchen. Thump. Thump. Heavy boots. Slow, deliberate, and heavy, much heavier than a human. The dust from the ceiling joists drifted down into the light of the hallway. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The entity in the basement, the thing with the wet chest and the smell of lilies, it hadn't been trying to break into room 1 to hurt me. It was trying to keep the door closed. It wasn't trapping me down here. It was hiding me. Because whatever is walking around in my kitchen right now, whatever broke in while the power was out, it's looking for me. And the thing in the basement knows it. The footsteps above stopped. The silence in the kitchen was heavier than the silence in the basement. It was a waiting silence. I looked at the scratched message on the door one last time. Do not leave. If the thing in room 23, the thing with the pile of teeth, was afraid of what was upstairs, I should have stayed in room 1. I should have curled up and waited to starve. But the primal instinct to see the sun, to breathe air that didn't taste like copper and sickness, overrode everything. I didn't walk. I bolted. I pushed off the doorframe of room 1 and sprinted toward the stairs. They were only 20 feet away. I could see the bottom step, the jagged concrete edge illuminated by the buzzing fluorescent lights. But as I ran, the distance didn't close. It was a nightmare made real. The hallway stretched. The black and white checkerboard floor seemed to elongate, adding more tiles with every step I took. I was running at full speed, my boots slamming against the floor, but the stairs remained 20 feet away. The air grew thick, turning into a gelatinous resistance. It felt like running underwater. My lungs burned, searing hot with every gasp. My legs felt leaden, the muscles firing but meeting invisible resistance. Scree, 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 screes. Behind me, far back in the deepening tunnel of the hallway, door 23 opened. I didn't look back. I knew what I would see. The shadow. The liquid movement. It was coming to keep me safe. It was coming to drag me back into the dark to protect me from the upstairs. No! I screamed, the word tearing out of my throat. I threw my weight forward, clawing at the air. I closed my eyes for a second, focusing only on the memory of the stairs, refusing to acknowledge the visual distortion. My shin smashed into concrete. The pain was blinding, but it was real. I had hit the first step. The distortion snapped back like a rubber band. I was at the bottom of the stairs. I scrambled up on all fours, tearing my jeans, scraping the skin off my palms. I could hear the wet, slapping footsteps behind me on the landing. It was right there. I threw myself through the pantry opening and into the kitchen, spinning around on my heel. The kitchen was empty. The morning sun was streaming in through the windows, blindingly bright, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. I slammed the steel door shut. I didn't just lock it. I pulled the key from my pocket, engaged the deadbolt, and then I snapped the key off inside the lock. But that wasn't enough. I could hear the handle turning from the other side. The heavy steel rattled in the frame. Clunk, clunk, clunk. It wanted out, or it wanted me back in. I ran to the garage. I grabbed the tube of industrial-grade construction adhesive and the 2-part epoxy I use for anchoring foundation bolts. I ran back to the pantry. I squeezed the entire tube of adhesive into the seams of the door. I mixed the epoxy and slathered it over the keyhole, over the hinges, over the gap between the frame and the wall. The chemical smell was acrid, burning my nose, masking the smell of the basement. Then, I went to the living room and dragged a heavy oak bookshelf, my grandfather's, solid wood, weighing 300 pounds across the floor. I shoved it into the pantry, wedging it tight against the hidden door. I collapsed on the kitchen floor, my chest heaving, watching the bookshelf. It didn't move. The rattling stopped. The basement was sealed. I was safe. That's what I thought. I lay there for 10 minutes, just breathing. Then, I saw the floor near the refrigerator. There were footprints. They weren't the small multi-toed prints from before. These were massive, heavy, muddy boot prints. They started at the back door, walked to the pantry, and then walked to the hallway leading to the bedrooms. And they didn't come back. It's been exactly 112 days since I sealed the pantry door. I haven't sold the house. I can't. My lawyer, David, told me that because of the structural alterations I made, welding a historic easement shut, the deed is currently frozen in litigation with the Historical Society. I'm trapped here financially until the courts decide what to do with the quiet ward. But that's not why I sleep in the driver's seat of my Jeep Grand Cherokee in the driveway every night. I sleep out here because the house doesn't belong to me anymore. The police came and took a report about the intruder. They saw the muddy boot prints leading to the hallway. They searched every room, every closet, and yes, they even checked the attic access panel in the guest bedroom ceiling. They found nothing. No intruder. No signs of forced entry on the exterior doors. They told me I probably tracked the mud in myself during the panic. They suggested stress counseling. They don't know about the basement. I didn't tell them. The basement has been silent. The epoxy held. The bookshelf is still wedged there. Whatever is in room 23, whatever made that pile of teeth, hasn't tried to come up again. I think I know why. Last Tuesday, during a heat wave, I went inside to grab some clothes. The air conditioning was off, and the house was sweltering. It was dead silent. I was standing in the hallway, right under the attic hatch, when I heard it. It wasn't the wet slapping sound of the thing from the basement. It was the humming. It was coming from above me, vibrating through the sheetrock of the ceiling. And underneath the hum, I heard the slow, heavy shifting of weight. The creak of a joist under massive pressure. The thing that walked through my kitchen, the thing with the heavy boots, it didn't leave. It went up. I realized then what the message on the basement door meant. Do not leave. I thought it was a threat. I thought the entity in the basement was telling me not to leave the room, so it could eat me. I was wrong. The thing in the basement, the thing that tore the padding off the walls and hid in the dark, it was terrified. The quiet ward wasn't a prison to keep it in. It was a bunker to keep something else out. It was trying to protect me. It was trying to keep me downstairs. in the safety of the reinforced steel and concrete, hidden away from the thing that stalks the upper levels. But I escaped. I ran right into the lion's den, and then I sealed the only safe place in the house. I'm writing this on my laptop in the front seat of my car. The sun is going down. I can see the attic window from here. It's a small, circular vent near the peak of the roof. There's no light on in the attic. But 5 minutes ago, I saw a face press against the vent slats. It was pale, broad, and it didn't have any eyes. Just smooth skin where the socket should be. It's watching me. If you see a listing for a renovated ranch at 42 Blackwood Lane, do not buy it. Do not tour it. And if you ever find yourself in a house with a steel door hidden in the pantry, don't open it. But if you do, and you see a message scratched into the metal telling you not to leave, listen to it.